December 17, 1804, 45 degrees below zero. The Missouri River had frozen solid enough to hold entire buffalo herds. Inside Fort Mandan, 33 American soldiers huddled around roaring fires that consumed 8 tons of wood weekly, and still their cabins barely reached 50 degrees. Men's toes turned black. Fingers went numb. The military specification fortress they'd built was losing the war against winter. 7 miles upriver, 3,000 people slept warm. No roaring fires, no desperate woodcutting parties, just dome-shaped mounds of earth that the Americans had dismissed as primitive hovels. Those hovels held temperatures the soldiers' best engineering couldn't match. This is the story of a 500-year-old technology that outperformed everything the young nation knew about staying alive. The ink in William Clark's journal had turned to black ice inside the bottle. Outside the walls of Fort Mandan, the air itself seemed to crack and splinter with each breath. Inside the American fort, 33 men huddled around fires that consumed cottonwood logs by the armful. They had felled 800 trees to build this place and fuel it through winter. They had constructed stone chimneys, 18-foot stockade walls, 2 rows of proper military cabins built the only way trained soldiers knew how to build. And still, the cold was winning. One man's toes had already turned black. Another couldn't feel his fingers. The fire roared constantly, and still the cabin temperature barely reached 50 degrees. Survivable, but only just. Only if you never stopped feeding the flames. 7 miles upriver, 3,000 people slept warm. No stockade walls, no military engineering, just dome-shaped mounds that barely rose above the frozen prairie, covered in snow, looking like nothing so much as the burrows of giant moles. Inside those mounds, families gathered around small central fires. Children slept without shivering. Elders told stories in comfortable warmth, while the worst cold in recorded memory tried to kill everything outside. The American soldiers had built walls against winter. The Mandan women had built something else entirely, a technology so effective it would take 2 centuries for European descendants to rediscover. But 6 months earlier, when the Corps of Discovery first encountered these strange earthen domes, they saw only primitive hovels, shelters built by people who didn't know any better. They were about to learn otherwise. Late October, 1804. The expedition had been moving upriver for 5 months. Captain Meriwether Lewis stood on the bow of the keelboat and watched ice forming at the river's edges. The Missouri was beginning to freeze. In 2 weeks, maybe 3, the water route would close entirely. 33 men, 1 boat, and a continent's worth of supplies would be locked in place until spring thaw, somewhere around April. That meant survival through 5 months of what the Mandan called the hunger moon season. 5 months in territory where January temperatures averaged 3.5 degrees below zero. 5 months where a man caught outside without shelter could freeze solid in under an hour. Lewis had planned for this. President Jefferson himself had approved the expedition's budget, its supplies, its timeline. They would build a winter fort using standard military construction techniques: log walls, stone chimneys, the same methods that had sheltered American soldiers since the Revolution. The numbers told a different story. Clark surveyed their landing site in the cottonwood bottomlands near the Mandan villages and began calculating. A proper fort would require 2 rows of cabins, at minimum, 4 structures to house the men. Each cabin meant hundreds of logs, support beams, roofing materials, plus the stockade wall for defense against potential Sioux attacks. They would need to fell, strip, haul, and fit more than 800 trees, in freezing temperatures, with ice forming on the river, with hostile nations potentially watching their every move, and that was just construction. Old Pierre Cruzat, the expedition's one-eyed French boatman who had wintered on the upper Missouri before, pulled Lewis aside one evening as the men made camp. The half-Omaha trader had survived in this territory when others hadn't. "You understand what comes?" Cruzat asked. His single eye studied Lewis with something between concern and calculation. "The cold here, she is not like Virginia cold, not like Kentucky cold. I have seen men freeze standing upright, seen trees split from the cold alone, crack like rifle shots in the night. Your stone chimneys, your log walls. He shook his head. You will burn trees faster than you can cut them. We'll manage, Lewis replied. We have 33 able men. You have 33 men who have never seen 40 below. Cruzat spat into the fire. The Mandan, they know something about winter. Their homes look strange to your eyes, yes? Like dirt piles, like animal burrows. He paused. They're warm inside those dirt piles when everything else freezes. Maybe you should ask them why. Lewis dismissed the suggestion with a wave. They were officers of the United States Army. They had been trained in construction, in survival, in military science. They would build a proper fort using proper methods. The Mandan could keep their molehills. On November 2nd, the men began felling trees. Snow was already falling. The temperature at dawn had dropped below freezing and would not rise above it again until March. Clark organized work parties with military precision. Axes rang against cottonwood from first light until dark. Men hauled logs through freezing mud, their breath pluming white in the bitter air. By November 13th, the temperature at sunrise had dropped further still, and the river was clogging with ice so thick that Lewis had to wade into freezing water to free a pirogue stuck on a sandbar. He emerged shaking, his legs numb to the hip. That night, the expedition's doctor treated the first cases of frostbite. Construction was not yet half complete. The brutal math pressed in from all sides. They needed the fort finished before the deep cold arrived. They needed firewood stockpiled, cords and cords of it, to fuel the constant fires that would be their only heat source. They needed food preserved, hunting parties organized, defensive positions established, and winter wasn't waiting. Sergeant John Ordway noted in his journal that the huts, once built, were warm and comfortable, but this comfort came at a cost the men were only beginning to understand. The fires could never stop. The woodcutting could never stop. Their survival would be measured in cords consumed and calories burned. 7 miles upriver, the Mandan and Hidatsa villages bustled with normal life. 3,000 people, perhaps as many as 5,000 across all 5 villages, prepared for winter the way they had prepared for generations uncounted. The women supervised final repairs to their homes. Children played in the streets between earthen domes. Hunters returned with meat that would freeze naturally in the coming cold, no need for the constant fire that the Americans would require. How could anyone build in this climate without constant flame? How could anyone survive 40 below in a house made of dirt? The answer was 7 miles away. The Americans had only to walk there and see, but they were not ready to learn from people they had already dismissed. The Mandan called their homes awadi. The Hidatsa called them awadi. Europeans, when they bothered to name them at all, called them curiosities, primitive shelters, evidence of a people who had not yet discovered proper architecture. What the Europeans failed to understand was that they were looking at 5 centuries of engineering refinement. The first earth lodges on the upper Missouri, dated to roughly 1300 AD. For 300 years before Columbus sailed, the village peoples of the northern plains had been perfecting a technology specifically designed to defeat the killing winters of this latitude. Generation after generation of women, because in Mandan and Hidatsa society, women owned and built the homes, had passed down the knowledge. Each generation refined the dimensions, adjusted the angles, optimized the materials. The result was a survival machine disguised as a pile of dirt. The construction began with site selection. The women chose locations near water, on defensible bluffs, with access to the cottonwood groves that would provide structural timber. Then came excavation. Workers dug pits 12 to 24 inches deep, some as much as 3 feet, creating a floor that sat below the frost line. This first step was invisible to European eyes and incomprehensible to European minds. Why dig down? Why not build up, as proper construction demanded? The answer lay in a principle the village women understood instinctively, though they would never have called it by its modern name, geothermal stability. 4 to 6 feet below the surface, soil temperature remains constant year-round. In this latitude, that constant temperature ranged between 50 and 57 degrees, regardless of whether the air above was 90 degrees in summer or 40 below in winter. By digging down, the women were tapping into the Earth's own furnace. The structural frame rose next. Men cut and placed 4 massive cottonwood posts in a square at the center of the pit. This was men's work, the heavy lifting of primary supports. But once those posts stood, the women took over. They supervised every remaining step. They placed the crossbeams. They wove willow branches across the frame in tight patterns, perfected over centuries. They laid thick mats of dried prairie grass over the willow. And then came the final layer, the crucial layer, the one that European observers saw and dismissed as barbaric. 4 inches of packed earth and sod, carefully applied over the entire dome. More earth tamped down over time until the structure looked like nothing so much as a natural hill, a molehill, as Alexander Henry the Younger would sneer in 1806. What Henry saw as primitive, the women knew as perfection. That earth layer created thermal mass, a thick buffer that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. Combined with the below-ground floor and the natural insulation of the grass mats, the earth lodge maintained a stable interior temperature with minimal fuel. A single central fire pit, fed with modest amounts of wood, could warm a structure 30 to 60 feet in diameter, large enough to house 10 to 20 people. The same fire that an American cabin consumed in a single day could heat a properly built earth lodge for a week. But the technology went deeper still. The entrance to every lodge faced southeast, positioned to catch morning sun while blocking the brutal northwest winds that howled across the plains in winter. The doorway extended outward in a long passage, an airlock, in modern terms, that prevented cold air from rushing directly into the living space. The central smoke hole could be adjusted with a movable cover, allowing women to control ventilation with the precision of a damper. Every element served a purpose. Every detail reflected generations of refinement, and none of it was visible to men who had been trained to see walls and chimneys as the only marks of civilization. In early November, as the Americans struggled to raise their log structures before the freeze set in, Chief Black Cat of the Mandan visited the construction site. He observed the cabins taking shape. He noted the stone chimneys, the thick log walls, the military precision of the layout. He said nothing critical. The Mandan were a diplomatic people skilled in trade and alliance building. But when Clark asked him about the coming winter, Black Cat's response was telling. "Your fires will work hard," the chief said through an interpreter. "Very hard." He did not elaborate. He did not explain what the women of his village could have explained, that the Americans were building a structure that fought against winter instead of working with it, that their chimneys would draw heated air out of the cabins almost as fast as the fires produced it, that their above-ground floors would never stop losing heat to the frozen earth below. The Americans had chosen their method. The Mandan would wait and watch, and winter would deliver its verdict. The view from the Earth Lodge villages was instructive. The Mandan and Hidatsa had been watching European strangers arrive for a century, French traders, British trappers, Spanish expeditions. Each group had built their own shelters using their own methods. Each group had struggled through winter while the village people stayed warm. Now the Sioux, Americans were making the same mistakes. From the perspective of a Mandan elder, call him Sheheki, the white coyote, who would later travel to Washington at Lewis's invitation, the spectacle at Fort Mandan was familiar, predictable, almost pitiable. "They cut trees like men running from a fire," Sheheki observed to his wife as they watched smoke rise from the American camp. "More and more trees. They think they can defeat the cold with wood alone." His wife, whose name the journals do not record, but whose knowledge they would come to depend upon, continued scraping a hide without looking up. "They will learn." Perhaps. Sheheke had seen Europeans refuse to learn before. "Or they will die, and others will come." This was not cruelty. It was realism. The village people had watched outsiders freeze for generations. Some accepted help and survived. Others clung to their own methods and suffered. The Mandan had learned long ago that they could not force wisdom upon visitors who had already decided they knew better. But the dynamics were complicated. The core of discovery had arrived with trade goods the Mandan wanted, metal tools, especially, which their blacksmith could produce. The Americans had also arrived during a period of tension between the Mandan and the Teton Sioux. An alliance, even a temporary one, served everyone's interests. So the Mandan waited, watched, and planned. Not all observers were so patient. A French-Canadian trader named René Jussomme had been living among the Mandan for over a decade. He had learned their language, taken a Mandan wife, adopted many of their ways, but he had never fully abandoned European assumptions about indigenous architecture. "You Americans," Jussomme said to Louis one evening, gesturing toward the village domes visible in the moonlight, "you look at those lodges and you see savages playing at houses. I understand. I saw the same thing when I first came." "And now?" Louis asked. Jussomme shrugged. "Now I know. Better. But knowing and understanding are different things. I have lived in those lodges. I know they are warm. I still cannot explain to you how a pile of dirt and grass keeps out 40 below. The women know. They will not explain to men." He laughed bitterly. "Maybe they cannot explain. Maybe some knowledge passes only through building, through doing, through," he searched for the word, "through the hands of daughters learning from mothers." Louis recorded this conversation in his journal. He did not record whether he took it seriously. The first hard test came in late November. A raiding party of Sioux had been spotted in the area. The Americans scrambled to defensive positions, grateful for their stockade walls. But the attack never came. The Sioux were after Mandan horses, not American soldiers. When the threat passed, Louis visited the Mandan village of Mitutanka to assess damage. He found none. The village had no defensive walls in the American sense, no stockade, no military perimeter. Yet the Sioux had not attacked the village itself. "Your men came running to their wooden walls," Chief Big White observed mildly. "We remained in our homes." "You had no defenses," Louis said. "We had the cold." Big White gestured toward the freezing plains. "And we had our lodges, which any attacker must enter through the door passage, one at a time, into a space where 20 defenders wait." He smiled. "Our homes are our fortress. Yours is only a place you hide." It was a tactical observation, not an insult, but it landed like one. Louis returned to Fort Mandan that night and found his men huddled around fires that seemed to devour wood without producing warmth. The walls of his cabin were solid, well constructed, built to military specifications. And still the cold seeped through every crack, every gap, every imperfection in the chinking. The temperature that night dropped to 15 below. Inside the earth lodges 7 miles upriver, families slept warm. December arrived like an enemy assault. The average temperature that month would be 4 degrees above zero. The coldest day would see the thermometer, if it survived, drop to 45 below. The Missouri had frozen so solid that Mandan hunters walked buffalo across the ice. Inside Fort Mandan, the mathematics of survival had become terrifyingly clear. Each cabin required approximately 1 cord of wood per week to maintain barely survivable temperatures. With 4 cabins housing the men, that meant 4 cords weekly. A cord of cottonwood weighed roughly 2 tons. The men were cutting, hauling, and burning 8 tons of wood every 7 days, and still the cabins barely reached 50 degrees. Meanwhile, their food supplies were dwindling. Clark's journal entries became a litany of cold and consumption. December 7th. The thermometer stood this morning at 16 degrees below zero. December 8th. The big horse died last night. December 10th. Several men complaining of cold sent them to the lodges of the Mandan to warm themselves. That last entry revealed more than Clark perhaps intended. The men had begun crossing the frozen river to seek warmth in the earth lodges. They came at first with official justifications, trading expeditions, diplomatic missions, information gathering. But the pattern revealed the truth. The American fort, built with all the engineering knowledge of the young republic, was failing. The primitive lodges of the Mandan were succeeding. The women of the Knife River villages must have found this darkly amusing. They had spent late summer and early fall performing the annual repairs that kept their homes functioning, repacking the earth where rain had eroded it, replacing damaged grass matting beneath the sod, adjusting the entrance passages, routine maintenance that any village woman learned as a girl. Now they watched the Americans struggle through tasks that should have been easy, staying warm, staying fed, staying alive. The charitable interpretation is that the women felt sympathy. The realistic interpretation is that they felt a complicated mixture of pity, exasperation, and something like vindication. Here were men who had looked at earth lodges and seen primitive hovels. Here were those same men crossing frozen rivers to escape their own well-built cabins. The village women had no word for "I told you so," but they had a culture that demonstrated it through every comfortable evening their families spent while the Americans shivered. The construction timeline had met its deadline. Fort Mandan was complete before the deep freeze, but completion revealed the design's fatal flaws. The stone chimneys drew heat upward and out of the cabins almost as efficiently as the fire produced it. The log walls, while solid, had no thermal mass, nothing to store heat and release it slowly. The above-ground floor sat directly on frozen earth, which sucked warmth from the interior like a vampire drawing blood. Every principle the Earth Lodge. Women understood the American builders had violated. It was Toussaint Charbonneau, the French-Canadian interpreter who would later bring his Shoshone wife, Sacagawea, to the expedition, who finally explained what the Americans were seeing. "You build a wall between yourself and winter," Charbonneau said, warming himself by a lodge fire while his hosts looked on. "The Mandan, they build a cave inside the earth. Your wall, she fights the cold. Their cave, she ignores the cold. You understand?" "Explain," Lewis said. Charbonneau pointed to the packed earth floor beneath them, then to the curved earthen walls rising around them. "Below the frozen ground, the earth is never cold, never hot. Always the same temperature, like a cellar, like a cave. The Mandan women, they build their homes into this warm earth. They use the ground itself as their furnace." He gestured toward the small fire in the central pit. "This fire, she does not fight winter. She only raises the temperature a little bit, from what the earth gives to what humans want. Your fires must raise the temperature from 40 below to 50 above. 90 degrees of fighting. This fire raises the temperature maybe 15, maybe 20 degrees. The earth does the rest." It was the most complete explanation any European had yet given, and still the Americans did not change their methods. They had built their fort. They would survive in their fort. Pride demanded no less, but survival would come at a cost. By late December, the expedition's hunters were struggling to find game. The cold made hunting nearly impossible. Men could not stay in the field long enough to track buffalo, and the smaller game had retreated to burrows and dens where the Americans' techniques could not reach them. The Mandan, by contrast, had buffalo. Their hunting methods had been refined over the same centuries as their architecture. They drove herds over cliffs and into box canyons using techniques that required coordination rather than long exposure to killing cold. They processed meat in their warm lodges, preserved it by the freezing temperatures outside, and stored it in underground caches that maintained consistent temperature year-round. The same geothermal principle that heated their homes preserved their food. In late December, as hunger began to press upon Fort Mandan, Lewis made a decision that must have tasted bitter. He sent Sergeant Nathaniel Pryor to the Mandan villages to trade for corn. The price was reasonable. The Mandan had been farming the Missouri River bottomlands for longer than any European nation had existed. Their corn surplus could feed the villages through any winter, with plenty left over for trade. They had no interest in watching the Americans starve. Dead men made poor trading partners. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The expedition that had arrived with presidential authority and military precision was now dependent on people they had viewed as primitives. The fort they had built with such confidence could not feed them. The lodges they had dismissed were stocked with food. Clark recorded the trades in his journal without commentary, but Private Joseph Whitehouse, whose journal survived despite official oversight, noted that the Mandan corn likely saved several lives that winter. The countdown continued. January brought temperatures that defied belief. The average for the month would be 3.5 degrees below zero, but averages deceive. Some days the temperature climbed to a relatively warm 15 above. Other days it crashed to 40 below and stayed there. January 10th, 1805. Sunrise temperature 40 degrees below zero. That morning, a Mandan boy stumbled into Fort Mandan with his feet frozen solid. He had been on a hunting trip when the cold caught him. He had survived the night somehow, but his toes had paid the price. Captain Lewis, who had trained in wilderness medicine under Dr. Benjamin Rush, examined the blackened flesh. There was nothing to be done. The toes would have to come off. Lewis performed the amputation with the tools available: a knife, a bone saw, a cauterizing iron. First one foot, then the other. The boy survived the surgery. He would walk again, but never hunt as he had before. The same journal entry recorded another Mandan's arrival. This man had also stayed out overnight without fire, in the same 40 below cold. Clark noted with what must have been astonishment that this man was not the least injured. How could two men face the same cold, and one lose his feet while the other walked away untouched? The answer, though Clark did not record it, lay in different levels of cold adaptation. The Mandan who survived had been preparing for this winter his entire life. His body had acclimated. His techniques, how to move, how to breathe, how to conserve heat, had been taught from childhood. He knew when to seek shelter, how to build emergency protection from snow and brush, how to survive what killed outsiders. The boy who lost his toes had been caught in circumstances beyond his experience. Young, perhaps overconfident, he had made the mistakes that the older man's training had eliminated. But both survived because they had somewhere warm to return to. The earth lodges waited with their constant temperatures, their efficient fires, their centuries of accumulated wisdom. For the Americans, there was no such refuge, only the hungry cabins of Fort Mandan, consuming wood and producing barely enough warmth to sustain life. The men developed a rotation for the fire watch. Someone had to feed the flames every hour, day and night. A lapse meant temperatures dropping toward the unsurvivable. A distracted watchman could doom everyone in the cabin to frostbite or worse. Private John Newman, who had been court-martialed earlier in the expedition for mutinous expression, drew more than his share of night watches. He would later write that he never experienced cold like that winter before or since, and Newman had grown up in Pennsylvania, where winters were not gentle. The fire was our god, Newman told a historian years later. We worshipped it with wood and woke each hour to make our offerings. The men who lived in the earth lodges had no such god. They slept through the night like reasonable people. We were slaves to our chimneys. It was bitter testimony from a bitter man, but it captured something true. The American approach to winter, walls and fire, barrier and battle, required constant effort. The Mandan approach, integration and insulation, earth and efficiency, required maintenance but not warfare. The Americans fought winter every minute of every day. The Mandan had made peace with it centuries before. By late January, the pattern was set. The core of discovery would survive, barely, through constant labor and Mandan generosity. The trade goods they had brought, especially the metalwork their blacksmith John Shields produced, earned them corn and meat enough to supplement their failing hunts. The Earth Lodge people kept them alive through charity disguised as commerce. But survival was not comfort. Survival was not warmth. Survival was the bare minimum, purchased at maximum cost. And the real test had not yet arrived. The temperatures would drop further in February. The food would grow scarcer. The wood would become harder to find as the nearest trees had already been felled. Outside the walls of Fort Mandan, the prairie waited under its blanket of snow. The cold had settled in like a permanent resident, patient and merciless. The men counted days until spring, knowing each dawn might bring temperatures that their straining fires could not fight. 7 miles upriver, the earth lodges stood quiet and warm. The women who had built them went about their winter work, processing hides, preparing food, teaching daughters the skills that would keep the next generation alive. They did not count days until spring. They did not fight the cold. They had built their answer to winter centuries ago, and it worked. But for the Americans to understand that, to truly understand it, would require something more than observation. It would require a crisis so severe that even military pride could not blind them to the truth. That crisis was coming. February 1805. The Hunger Moon. The Mandan called it that because this was when food ran lowest, when autumn's abundance had been consumed, and spring's renewal remained months away. For the Americans at Fort Mandan, the name carried a more immediate truth. Their hunters returned empty-handed more often than not. The corn traded from the Mandan dwindled. The men grew thinner. But it was the cold that commanded attention. January had been brutal. February would be worse. The expedition's thermometer had already failed once, the mercury contracting beyond the instrument's range. When it worked, it recorded temperatures that seemed impossible. 20 below, 30 below, numbers that turned breath to ice crystals before it left the mouth. Inside the fort, the men had achieved something like equilibrium. Not comfort, never comfort, but a sustainable misery. The fire rotation continued without fail. The woodcutting parties went out each morning and returned each evening with barely enough fuel to maintain the flames through another night. The cabins held at 50 degrees, sometimes 45, rarely warmer. It was enough to survive. It was not enough to thrive. Sergeant Patrick Gass, the expedition's carpenter who had supervised much of the fort's construction, made an entry in his journal that revealed more than he perhaps intended. "Visited the Mandan village," he wrote on February 3rd. "Their lodges are large and warm." Large and warm. 4 words that captured what the American cabins were not. The men had been crossing the frozen river with increasing frequency. Official reasons were always given: trading, diplomacy, gathering intelligence about the route west. But the pattern told its own story. A man who spent an afternoon in an earth lodge returned to Fort Mandan restored. A man who stayed in the fort all day emerged gaunt and gray. Private George Shannon, the youngest member of the expedition at 19, developed a cough that wouldn't clear. The cold air seared his lungs each morning. The barely warm cabin offered no relief. He began spending as much time as regulations allowed in the Mandan villages, accepting hospitality that the expedition's pride officially forbade acknowledging. The earth lodges had proven themselves through the first half of winter. The families inside them had not suffered the privations the Americans endured. Their children did not cough. Their elders did not shake with cold that penetrated to the bone. But the village people knew something the Americans did not. February was always the test. This was when the deepest cold arrived. This was when the weak died and the strong survived. The earth lodges had been built for this month specifically, 5 centuries of refinement aimed at defeating February on the upper Missouri. The Americans had built for military specifications. They were about to discover whether military specifications could survive a plains winter. The temperature on February 7th dropped to 32 degrees below zero. It would not be the coldest day that month. Not by far. The blizzard arrived on February 11th without warning. 1 hour the sky was clear, bitter cold, yes, but the pale winter sun offered at least the illusion of warmth. The next hour, the northwestern horizon had turned black. Wind began to rise. Snow started falling, then driving, then screaming horizontal across the frozen prairie. Within 2 hours, visibility dropped to nothing. A man could not see his own outstretched hand. The snow came not from above, but from everywhere, swirling, blinding, filling every gap in clothing, every crack in the fort's walls. The temperature, which had been 22 below at dawn, continued to drop. Captain Clark ordered all men inside. The hunting party that had left that morning was somewhere on the prairie. 4 men, including George Drouillard, the expedition's best tracker. There was no way to find them, no way to help them. The storm had swallowed them whole. Inside Fort Mandan, the crisis began almost immediately. The wind found the chinking between logs that had seemed solid enough in calm cold. Gusts drove snow directly into the cabins, coating bunks and supplies with white powder that melted against warm skin and froze again against cold wood. The men stuffed rags into gaps, pressed blankets against walls, did everything they could to stop the infiltration. It was not enough. The fires roared. The wood supply dwindled. Clark calculated quickly. At this rate of consumption, they had perhaps 36 hours of fuel, maybe 48 if they let the temperatures drop to dangerous levels. The storm showed no sign of stopping. "We need the wood detail," Sergeant Ordway said, stating what everyone knew and no one wanted to acknowledge. "In this?" Clark gestured toward the door, beyond which the world had become a white scream of wind and ice. "They'd be dead in an hour. We'll be dead in 2 days if we don't get more fuel." This was the math of frontier survival, reduced to its brutal essence. Risk death now for certain death later. Send men into the killing storm or watch the fires die. Clark made his decision. A volunteer party would go out at first light, if the storm had eased even slightly, to retrieve wood from the nearest stand of cottonwoods. They would rope themselves together. They would not go far. They would bring back what they could carry and return before the cold took them. It was a plan born of desperation. Everyone knew it. That night, the temperature inside the cabin dropped to 38 degrees. The fires burned constant, hot. It made no difference. The wind was stealing heat faster than the flames could produce it, sucking warmth through every crack and gap in the structure the men had built with such confidence 3 months before. Private John Coulter, who would later become the first European to see the Yellowstone geysers, pressed himself against the cabin wall and felt the cold radiating through the logs. "It's like the wall is made of ice," he said to no one in particular. "We might as well be sleeping outside." He was exaggerating, but not by much. 7 miles upriver, the same storm raged. The same wind howled across the same frozen prairie, driving the same snow in the same horizontal fury. The temperature dropped the same impossible degrees. February's hunger moon showed no favorites, but inside the earth lodges, the experience was entirely different. The women had prepared for this. Every woman old enough to manage a household had prepared for this. The entrance passages, those long, tunnel-like corridors that European eyes saw as strange and primitive, served as airlocks against the wind. The snow could not drive directly into the living space. The gusts could not reach the interior. The thick earthen walls, covered now in additional snow that the storm itself provided, offered insulation that no amount of log construction could match. The wind that found every crack in Fort Mandan's walls broke against the earth lodges like waves against stone. It could not penetrate. It could not steal heat. It could not kill. And beneath those earthen walls, beneath the packed dirt floor, the earth maintained its constant temperature. 52 degrees. 55. Regardless of what happened above ground, the planet itself provided a baseline warmth that the small central fires could easily enhance. The families gathered around those fires told stories. Children played. Elders napped. The storm that was killing the American expedition's wood supply, that was threatening to freeze 33 men in their military specification cabins, was merely weather to the Earth Lodge people. They had built for this. Their mothers had built for this. Their grandmothers and great-grandmothers, back through generations beyond counting, had built for this. The storm raged for 3 days. At Fort Mandan, those 3 days became an endurance test that several men would later describe as the worst of the entire expedition. Worse than the grizzly attacks, worse than the mountain crossings, worse than the hunger that would come on the return journey. The volunteer wood party went out on the morning of the second day. The storm had eased slightly. Visibility extended to perhaps 20 feet instead of 0. 6 men, roped together, carrying axes and determination and not much else. They were gone for 4 hours. Clark paced the cabin like a caged animal, unable to see beyond the walls, unable to know whether his men were alive or dead. The fire had dropped to dangerous levels. The remaining men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat because the cabin could no longer provide enough. When the wood party returned, they brought perhaps a quarter cord, enough for 1 day, maybe 2 if they were careful. 3 men had frostbite on their faces. One had lost feeling in his left hand and would not regain full use of the fingers. It was not enough. It would have to be enough. The storm finally broke on February 14th. The sun emerged onto a world transformed. Snow drifted higher than a man's head in places, the river invisible under white, the temperature at dawn registering 29 degrees below zero. And the hunting party was still missing. Druyar and his 3 companions had been gone for 4 days now. 4 days in the worst storm the expedition had witnessed. 4 days without shelter, without fire, without hope of rescue. Clark organized a search party. They found the hunters 12 miles from the fort, huddled in a snow cave they had dug into. Adrift. Alive. Barely. Druyar's feet were frozen, though he would eventually recover full function. The others had varying degrees of frostbite on extremities and faces. They had survived by doing what the Mandan did, going underground. "We dug into the snow," Druyard explained later, his voice still hoarse from cold. "The wind could not reach us below the surface. The snow itself became our blanket." It was the same principle the earth lodges employed, applied in desperate improvisation. The earth, even frozen earth, even snow, provided insulation that the air above could not. Druyard had discovered in extremity what the Mandan women had known for 500 years, but the hunting party's survival only highlighted the expedition's larger failure. The storm had cost them. 4 men injured, wood supplies critically depleted, food stores lower than ever, and the cold had not relented. The post-storm days brought the deep freeze that always followed such blows, temperatures dropping to 40 below and holding there with cruel persistence. On February 16th, Clark made a decision that the official journals recorded only obliquely. He sent a party to the Mandan villages, not to trade, not for diplomacy, but to ask for help. The Mandan response was immediate and generous. Corn arrived, dried meat, squash from the previous autumn's harvest, enough to see the expedition through the worst of the crisis. The village people did not gloat. They did not demand excessive payment. They provided what was needed because that was what neighbors did in this country, even neighbors who had been dismissed as primitives, even neighbors whose homes had been called molehills. And they extended another invitation. The Americans were welcome to warm themselves in the earth lodges whenever they needed. It was charity offered with dignity, accepted with what grace the expedition could muster. For the remainder of February, the pattern held. The Americans survived in their fort through constant labor and Mandan generosity. Their fires never stopped burning. Their wood parties never stopped cutting. Their survival was purchased hour by hour, cord by cord, in a battle against winter that the Earth Lodge people had stopped fighting centuries ago. The contrast could not have been clearer. Clark's journal entry for February 20th captured it in official language. "The day has been exceedingly cold. The Mandan remain comfortable in their lodges while we struggle to maintain adequate heat." It was as close to an admission as military pride would allow. The thaw began in late March. The Missouri started moving again, great slabs of ice groaning and cracking as the river reasserted itself. The temperature climbed, above zero, then above freezing, then into ranges that felt almost tropical after the months of killing cold. The Corps of Discovery had survived. Barely, but survived. As the expedition prepared to continue west, Captain Lewis took time to document what they had learned. His journal entries from this period reveal a man whose assumptions had been fundamentally challenged and who was honest enough to acknowledge it. "The earth lodges of the Mandan and Hidatsa nations," Lewis wrote, "provide warmth and comfort far exceeding what our construction methods achieved. The natives suffer little from the extreme cold that so afflicted our party, owing to the superior insulation their building techniques provide." It was a remarkable admission from a man trained in European methods, sent by a president who believed American civilization represented the pinnacle of human achievement. Lewis was acknowledging, in writing that would be preserved for history, that the primitive people of the Missouri had solved a problem that the expedition's best efforts could not. Clark's parallel journals echoed the same recognition. He described visiting the earth lodges and finding them warm and well ventilated, noting that the structures maintained comfortable temperatures with far less fuel than our own quarters required. The State Historical Society of North Dakota would later summarize it directly. Both Lewis and Clark expressed amazement at the vigor and resiliency of the Mandan and Hidatsa in these extreme conditions, as well as the warmth earth lodges provided. Amazement from men who had crossed the continent, from men who had survived grizzly attacks and rapids and hostile nations. The warmth of a pile of dirt and grass amazed them, but recognition came too late to change anything. The expedition departed in early April, pressing west toward the mountains and the Pacific beyond. They left behind the lessons of the earth lodges, carrying instead their European assumptions about proper construction, the knowledge that could have helped future settlers, that could have saved countless lives in the frontier years to come, remained with the people who had developed it, and those people were running out of time. The American visitors had brought more than trade goods and military presents. They had brought disease. The winter of 1804 to 1805 saw the first cases of what the Mandan called the white man's sickness. Coughs that wouldn't clear, fevers that burned despite the cold, children dying from ailments their parents had never seen. It was only the beginning. In 1781, smallpox had swept through the Missouri River villages, killing perhaps half the Mandan population. The survivors had rebuilt, adapted, continued. But 1804 brought new exposure, new vulnerability, new death, and 1837 would bring the end. The smallpox epidemic of that year killed 90% of the remaining Mandan. From a population that had once numbered in the thousands, some estimates suggest as many as 15,000 at the height of their civilization, the Mandan were reduced to perhaps 100 survivors. The knowledge went with them. Earth, lodge construction continued among the survivors and their Hidatsa and Arikara allies, who merged into what would become the three affiliated tribes. But the scale was different. The confidence was different. A technology that had sustained a civilization for 5 centuries became the practice of a remnant, then a memory, then almost nothing at all. By the late 19th century, the earth lodges had been replaced by timber frame houses. Government policies encouraged, often forced, the adoption of European building methods. The old ways became ceremonial only, maintained for cultural preservation rather than practical survival. The women who had held the knowledge, who had passed it from mother to daughter for generations beyond counting, had no daughters to teach. The building techniques that had kept thousands alive through winters that nearly killed the best-equipped military expedition in American history faded from practical use, and the Europeans who replaced them never learned what they had lost. Settler families arriving in Dakota Territory in the 1860s and 70s built the same kind of structures Fort Mandan had been: log cabins, timber frames, buildings that fought winter instead of working with it. They burned through forests of wood each winter. They shivered through nights that the Mandan had slept through in comfort. Some of them died. The letters and diaries of frontier settlers are full of cold, full of fire that could never produce enough warmth, full of the same struggle the Corps of Discovery had experienced, repeated across thousands of homesteads by people who had no idea a solution had existed right beneath their feet. The Earth Lodge technology had been right there. It had been proven over centuries. It had been demonstrated for European observers who recorded their amazement in journals that would be preserved and published and studied for generations. And still the knowledge disappeared. It would take nearly 200 years for it to be rediscovered. In 1971, architect Malcolm Wells published a manifesto that would launch a movement. Nowhere in nature, Wells wrote, do we find the Earth's surface covered with waterproof membranes designed to shed water as far as possible from the buildings. Only man does this, and then wonders why his water supplies fail. Wells was arguing for what he called earth-sheltered architecture, buildings designed to work with the ground rather than against it. Buildings that used the constant temperature of soil below the frost line. Buildings that employed thermal mass to store and release heat efficiently. He thought he was inventing something new. He was rediscovering what the Mandan women had perfected 500 years before. The earth-sheltered movement of the 1970s and 80s developed independently of any knowledge about earth lodges. Architects and engineers worked out the principles from first principles, the same. principles the village women had understood through centuries of practice. Geothermal stability, soil temperature 4 to 6 feet below ground, remains constant at 50 to 57 degrees, regardless of surface conditions. Thermal mass, Earth absorbs heat during warm periods and releases it during cold, smoothing temperature variations naturally. Insulation through integration, a building that is part of the ground rather than sitting on top of it gains protection that no amount of wall insulation can match. Every principle the modern earth-sheltered architects celebrated, the Mandan had employed. Every innovation they claimed as breakthrough, the village women had known before Columbus sailed. In 1987, architect Michael Reynolds began building what he called earth ships in New Mexico, structures that used earth berming, thermal mass, and passive solar design to maintain comfortable temperatures without conventional heating or cooling. The earth lodges had done the same thing, with materials that came from the immediate landscape, using techniques that any village woman could teach her daughter. Reynolds became famous. The Mandan women remained largely forgotten. In 1997, the National Park Service established Knife River Indian Village's National Historic Site on the location of the Hidatsa villages where the Lewis and Clark expedition had spent the winter of 1804. The site includes reconstructed earth lodges, built using traditional techniques, maintained by descendants of the women who had developed them. Visitors today can walk inside those reconstructions. They can feel the temperature difference between the frigid plains, winter, and the comfortable interior. They can understand viscerally what Lewis and Clark had understood too late, that the mole hills were marvels of engineering. In 2018, the Living Stone Lodge project on the Fort Berthold Reservation began designing modern homes inspired by traditional Earth Lodge principles. Working with architects and engineers from the MHA Nation, the project developed plans for homes that could maintain safe indoor temperatures for up to 21 days without any power. 21 days. 3 weeks of survivable temperatures with no fuel, no electricity, no constant labor to maintain warmth. The same performance the Mandan women achieved, using the same principles, adapted for modern materials and modern needs. The knowledge had not died entirely. It had gone dormant, waiting in the earth itself for someone to remember. February 1805, 45 degrees below zero. 33 American soldiers huddled around fires that could never burn hot enough, in cabins that could never hold warmth long enough, fighting a war against winter they could not win. 7 miles upriver, 3,000 people slept warm. The American soldiers had been trained in proper construction. They had built walls, chimneys, structures that represented the best engineering their young nation could offer, and they had nearly died. The Mandan women had built something that looked like nothing at all, piles of dirt, molehills, primitive shelters that European eyes dismissed without understanding. Those primitive shelters had been keeping people alive for 500 years. They would keep people alive for another 30, until disease accomplished what winter never could. The men who survived that winter at Fort Mandan went on to cross the continent, to see the Pacific Ocean, to become the heroes of a national origin story. Their names are remembered. Their journals are studied. Their achievement is celebrated. The women who built the earth lodges have no names in those journals. Their achievement is mentioned only in passing, a few words about warm lodges, a note about the natives' comfort, an expression of amazement that Clark thought worth recording. But the truth is there for anyone who looks. The most advanced technology doesn't always look like technology at all. Sometimes it looks like a pile of dirt built by women who understood something the newcomers hadn't learned, that the ground itself is a furnace, if you know how to use it. Lewis and Clark brought home specimens and maps and tales of wonders. They did not bring home the one discovery that could have saved the most lives in the century to come: the simple, elegant, world-changing knowledge of how to survive winter by going underground. The frontier that followed them was full of freezing settlers, burning through forests, fighting the cold exactly as Fort Mandan had fought it, and losing over and over again. The answer was there all along, buried in plain sight, waiting in the earth.